right. Okay, this works. So, hello everyone. This is the first conference I'm speaking at since COVID happened. So having all these people in front of me, it feels very surreal. And I'm so happy and thankful to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk to all of you about my favorite topic in the world, which is CSS. Like, we're at a front-end conference, right? So I'm going to assume that a lot of you are in the business of displaying web content on a digital screen, which could be of any and all sizes. And to me, that's the fun of building for the web. So my name is Hui Jing, and it's a Chinese name, so my family name comes first. I'm not a complicated person at all. These emojis pretty much sum up who I am as a person. You can talk to me about them later if you want to. And I also have a day job as a front-end developer with Shopify because, I like to pay my rent and stuff, But okay, move on. So why are we talking about CSS today? Well, if content is going to be rendered by a browser engine, then your main mode of communication with the browser for styling that content has to be CSS. And I'm sure everybody today has their own opinion about CSS. Some of you might love it as much as I do. Others might think, oh, it's this hard-to-use API that I would like to avoid as much as possible. And then a big swath of you are like, I don't care, it's my job. And that's great. Regardless of your opinions on CSS, I am not here to tell you what to think or how to feel. It's just that the reality is that browser engines today are much more capable than they were before. And they can lay out content much better than before. So it's in our best interest just to know how to make full use of the browser's web layout capabilities. And technology evolves very fast. I know Ben is upstairs talking about voice UI. But as of now, as of today, most web interactions still involve a screen. And these screens can be as small as a watch face some of you are wearing. It could be like a 70-inch Super HD TV. And you, as the developer, the designer, the creator, can't control this. Which means that the way we think about designing layouts on the web cannot be like anything else that is fixed. It's quite a different mental model, and the tools that we use must suit this fluid and interactive medium. But luckily for us, now that Flexbox and Grit are very well supported across all major browsers, our toolbox has been greatly upgraded. Both of these layout models I mentioned were introduced after the web had evolved to be more than just a document viewer. They were built to handle application interfaces, which would be viewed across many different screen sizes. Admittedly, Flexbox had a pretty rocky rollout because browsers kind of tried, then they implemented experimental versions of the syntax before the specification had been nailed down. So you have things like this, But by 2015, all the major browsers had updated to use the latest specification, so it was considered stable. Now the browser vendors and the spec authors, they learned. They learned from Flexbox, and for Grit, they did it a little bit differently. So they still needed developers like yourself and me to test out this new layout model in the early stages. But instead of using vendor prefixes, they chose to implement this pre-finalized version behind a feature flag. So this meant that if developers wanted to use it, they had to manually access this browser configuration. So this is like the page that tells you that your warranty is null and void if you change anything. No, I'm kidding. But it does kind of warn you that you might break something. So non-developers would most likely never encounter or attempt to touch these settings. So this approach allowed the browser vendors to collect feedback while still minimizing the odds that they would actually ship this unfinalized syntax to production before it was ready. So Grit was rolled out in a very coordinated manner in 2017. So all major browsers shipped it in the month of March. And even by October, Edge and Samsung Internet supported Grit. It's like very different from Flexbox. But we fast forward to today, the percentage of internet users surfing the web with browsers that support both Flexbox and Grit is overwhelmingly high. Browser support is kind of not really a valid excuse or argument to why the adoption rates I feel are lower than expected. For what it's worth, Flexbox is everywhere. It has become the go-to for many web layouts. I'm happy about that. And after seeing my 1000th, how to center something vertically article, I'm not surprised it caught on very well. It's like everyone's favorite thing. And although this particular survey has a relatively small sample size, 8,000 plus developers, it did prompt me to wonder, like, why are the grid numbers a little bit lower than I expected? Among the 13 links that I have in my bookmarks bar, I could only find grid usage on CodePen, Discord, Inbox, and Spotify. And only Spotify seemed to really embrace grid as a page layout tool with named grid areas and all. I thought it was kind of interesting. I have a theory, and it has to do with how people have been using and building for the web over the years since it started. Because once the web protocol and source code was released into the public domain in about '93, it really started to take off. Like, people started creating websites left, right, and center. You could share your love of your favorite band, talk about your life in a diary, post pictures of cats, all from behind your keyboard. And lots of other people, whom you might never ever meet in person, could also consume all of your content, all from behind their keyboard. And you know what else people realized they could do with the web? They could create websites to sell shit and make a buck. So the dot-com bubble did burst. As Laura mentioned earlier this morning, it did burst, but that did not erase the fact that the web is a place where you can run an economically viable business. If we boil it down, the web is a data transmission technology, which is a tool that we can leverage for many different purposes. And I've heard opinions that express some level of dismay at how complicated the web has become. I will not deny that the web can be complicated, but it has retained so much of its original simplicity as well. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that if you knew how to create and publish a website back in 1994, you could still create and publish that same website today. Sure, you'd have to figure out a modern-day web hosting solution, but like this is a website, and it can exist on the internet today, just like it did back in 1994. It's just that when commerce and money is involved, complexity becomes inevitable. That's just my humble opinion. So JavaScript came into the picture in '95, and there was a need for a scripting language that could run on the client side. Apparently, it was to do form validation. I'm not sure how true that bit is, but we did need a lightweight scripting language that could run on the client. So a couple of years later, the concept of AJAX, which is short for asynchronous JavaScript and XML, started to take off because it allowed bits of content on your page to be updated dynamically without needing to reload the entire page. So this is the concept on which single-page applications, or SPAs, are built on. This term single page is very misleading to me because my mind has anchored the word page to physical books. So even the largest book I can think of, maybe like an atlas, encyclopedia around this size, that's what I think of. But when you think about a lot of the commercial spas out there these days, it's more like a page the size of this room, so it's like spa. And with the increase in scale and hence complexity, the organization of code becomes a lot more crucial, and frameworks can help provide structure. But with frameworks, they also come certain restrictions on how you need to do things. And I found that I haven't encountered folks discussing how it was like to implement CSS Grid within the bounds of their framework of choice. Because personally, I would love to hear how folks at different organizations deal with the constraints unique to their context. But let's first do a quick run-through of how Grid works and how to use it. Very similar to Flexbox, it involves a parent-child relationship between the container and its immediate children. So when you apply grid properties onto the container, it will have an impact on the grid items. And the grid items themselves, they have an awareness of the siblings around them. The bare minimum to start using grid as a layout tool is you can just set display to grid and then define some columns. Theoretically, you don't need to define the rows because the rows will just naturally be as large as it needs to contain the content within that row. Now, if your grid needs to be more complicated, there are helpful functions and properties that can keep your code neat. A great example is gap. I love gap. It's a very easy way to introduce spacing between your grid items, which is something that we didn't have before, very useful. If your grid needs to be a little bit more complicated, there's useful things like the repeat function. So instead of typing that 4 times, I could do something like this. Let's see how well I can type. No, that's not how you do it. So you can do repeats. You could use keywords, right? Keywords like, say, auto. Let's go with auto fit. And you have additional functions like the min-max function that can help you do responsive design. My finger doesn't work with the shift key. So you could do something like this, and it's pretty convenient, I would say, because you can do like responsive grid without having to write a lot of media queries. So these are possibilities that grid introduces, right? Another particularly useful feature that I personally am a big fan of is named grid areas, which you might have noticed in the screenshot for Spotify's interface a bit earlier. So after you've set up your rows and columns, here I have 2 columns and 3 rows, you can explicitly name specific areas of the grid using this, I would say it's a rather visual syntax, right? So each of the lines enclosed within the quote marks correspond to the rows. So I have three lines for 3 rows, and the values within the quote marks correspond to the columns. So I have 2 columns. And I like to make use of this for designs that need to break at multiple viewports, because all my changes can be contained on the parent selector, which is the grid. So if you see at the bottom, once I've assigned each grid item its area, I don't really need to change it regardless of what I do to the parent. So something rather straightforward. Let's say I just want to swap the position of main and sidebar. So I can do that. I can, let's say I decide that, well, maybe I want like a 3 column. So let's try this. 3 column, okay. Again, don't need to touch the actual items. Let's give that a header and maybe do that. And then let's make the sidebar longer. Did I type it wrongly? How do you spell sidebar? S-I-D. English, so difficult. So as you can see when I was messing around, you do need your values to correspond. Like a 3x3, you have to have like 3x3 values, otherwise the browser's like, I don't understand what you're saying, move, and all your stuff just moves out. But the way to use grid areas, I feel is really convenient, especially, like now this is a very contrite example, only 4 grid items. But let's say you have a longer page, you have like 20 items on there. You really, I mean, you can, right? You can go to each individual item and tweak it at each breakpoint. But if you could just do it on the parent, I feel that from an organizational perspective, it really, really helps a lot. So that's why I like named areas. But of course, naming the grid areas, that's actually optional, right? The regular way of placing items is to define its grid row and grid column properties. So I'm gonna try turning on the grid inspector here, and oh wow, that's tiny. For what it's worth, I'm using Firefox right now, but Chrome and Safari also have their own version of the grid overlay. So I'm really happy that all the browsers have kind of tried to achieve parity, so you can do the grid overlay in your browser of choice. As you can see, I'm buying for time because my eyesight is so bad, I cannot see anything. There, okay. So if I turn it on, the grid is off, isn't it? It's the wrong one, eh? Okay, let's try this again. Ah, wrong element. Okay. What on earth am I looking at? Sorry. Got it. That's fun. There you go. So if you turn on the grid overlay, you can see the grid lines that your grid that you've defined for your grid, and then you can assign your items based on the columns and row numbers. So for this particular feature, I think is very useful for doing overlap design. So I don't know about your life experience, but I somehow keep working with designers who are like, hey, let's overlap these things. It looks really classy when you overlap it. I'm like, sure, no problem. And I feel that grid makes overlapping elements in the design a lot more controllable than all the other methods that I've tried before. And trust me, I've tried a lot of them. I've used absolute positioning, I've used transforms, I've used negative margins. And it always looks great at one particular spot, and then it just starts to go south after. And sometimes I'm just even tell my designer, like, just look at it there. That's great. Don't change the window size. And then they do it like, oh, it's broken. But with grid, can I even get this? With grid, it's a lot more controllable. I can't even see this. Okay. With grid, the way you use it and the fact that grid has these, how should we put this, flexible units like FR, I can kind of predict and control the overlap. Like for this example, I'm like, I want the overlap to always be 300, and I can do that. Even as the viewport changes, because the flexible units are on the sides, it doesn't really run that much, which is not an experience that I had with all the other, how should we put this, the other techniques that I've used. So I'm gonna close this off. I think that's the end of my live coding and terrible eyesight. So there's more to grid than I've just mentioned, but I think what I've covered so far, it's already sufficient for a very large range of use cases already. And a major difference between building layouts with grid versus other layout models is that CSS grid layouts are led by the container. So you implement your intended layout on the container in a sort of big picture way, and then your items can be placed accordingly. Whereas the other layout models are item-led. So the sizing and the position of the items are what are determined on properties that you apply on the item themselves. So the grid is not really a grid. It's just kind of like you force the grid to exist because you made all of them the same size. So if you look at like maybe the fourth box for item-led, it seems like the 8th item is below it. But once you change its size, like they don't know who's on top of them or who's below them. It just happened to end up that way. But in grid, it's different. In grid, this is what I mean when I said that there's like an awareness of the siblings, because no matter what size the item becomes, if it's allocated to that grid, it's going to be there. So I think this is a relatively different mental model from what people are used to. So maybe that's a contributing factor to why grid is not as widespread as it could be. But it's not like grid is the end-all, be-all of building web layouts on the web. It's just one more additional tool you have in your toolbox. So floats are still great for actually floating content. And Flexbox is great for handling free space or the lack thereof in your layout. And grid is perfect for when you want structured rows and columns, right? You just get better tools to do more specific things. And as an application grows bigger with more features, more components, more pages, you end up having to adopt some sort of a design system, or at least develop some design guidelines to maintain consistency across the application, and often a grid system is part of that. And clearly, I stole all of this content from Bootstrap. A common pattern for grid systems in front-end libraries relies on generating all the classes needed for the percentages needed for each sizing on the grid that you may or may not use. This is grid source code. Like, this is Bootstrap source code. I didn't write this. But if you think about it, when Bootstrap migrated from floats to Flexbox, it wasn't that drastic a refactor because the sizing still was applied on the items themselves. I'm thinking if they were ever going to migrate to grid, it's going to be a very, very big rewrite. And I think that's a bit of a challenge. But for the scope of today, let's simplify things a little bit, and let's say that we have the luxury of implementing a brand new design system, and we can build out a grid system for that. It's not a migration, it's just build this new thing, fun. So here we have the specifications for a rather standard looking grid, whereby it has different values to accommodate a range of viewport sizes. You know, when it's small, then do 4 columns, bump it to 8 wider, a little wider, do 12, that kind of thing. And so there are plenty of different approaches you could take to write CSS code to implement those specs in an application powered by JavaScript. We will go through just a couple of them just to give you an idea. And I'm going to be using React for the examples, but I think these ideas are transferable to any other framework of your choice. So the first option I want to suggest is, just write the CSS. And the rationale for this approach is that the grid would inform where everything on the application would sit within the interface. So it's not a bad idea to put it in the global style sheet that gets loaded everywhere, since the expectation is that it would be used for everything on your application. So all of the specifications on the table would be defined on the grid container. And the placement of the items within the grid can be assigned to each individual grid item if necessary, or it could just be auto-placed by the browser. So if you want like 4 columns at the start, you would define them. And then if you bump up to the next viewport, you can bump up your column size, bump up your gutter size, bump up your gap size, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the stuff is all needs to be set up only on the container. When it comes to the item placement, then the code could go onto the component styles. If they're very common placement patterns, like the half width, the third width, the quarter width, I'm not good with naming things, call it what it is, right? Then you could consider having pre-written styles to cater to those situations, or not, it's up to you. If you have some very custom placement, like I want this to take up 7 columns or 5 columns, sure, you can put those on your component styles, right? So this is just one option. Another option we could talk about is how about let's have wrapper components for the grid container and the item. So the grid code becomes tied to the wrapper components instead of being loaded into the global style sheet. It's a different approach, right? I kind of ran into some specificity issues because I use CSS modules, but it was a very painless workaround. I'll talk about it later. But this particular setup for option 2 involves creating a grid component and a column component with their corresponding style sheets. And these components, because they don't do much other than just provide grid-related styling, they're not very long, pretty short, not very big, not very complicated. They have props for passing custom class names. You can also modify the element tag, which defaults to div, but you don't want to use a div for everything. There's so many HTML tags, so you can customize that. Generally, it doesn't restrict users from passing other props because you want to keep this as lightweight and single function as possible. So something like that might work. And then the styles would be the same as in option 1, but because this approach can use CSS modules, you can kind of be more casual with your class naming. So the grid container styles are exactly the same as option 1, but the item classes can look like this, full, half, third, quarter, or I don't know, if you want to do grapefruit, melon, I don't know. But because CSS modules takes care of the class clashing for you, you could do something like this. So this is the issue that I ran into with components, is that if I wanted to overwrite my pre-written item styles, I had to bump the specificity of my component styles up just a little bit because CSS modules loaded my component styles before my wrapper styles. I like to keep specificity low, so I just bumped up 1 element's worth. But if someone who's really, really good at CSS modules has advice on how to deal with the style loading order, please let me know. And yet another option, because we have to be open-minded and explore all options, is to use Tailwind classes. I'll be upfront about this. I am not the biggest fan of Tailwind. The major issue that I have with it is that it seems to see the cascade as a problem to be fixed rather than an attribute to be embraced. But because, if you think about it, if you use Tailwind the way it was intended, the cascade is almost kind of negated. And so, it's called CSS cascading style sheets for a version. Maybe, how about we rebrand to Tailwind SS? That being said, this is not a hill that I need to die on. If my job needs me to write Tailwind, I can do it the way it was intended. Because for now, I accept the reality that there are quite a number of teams out there that use Tailwind CSS in their application, and it's working really well for them. And that's great. So if those teams want to implement CSS Grid in their application, well, absolutely doable. Tailwind has, admittedly, they have exposed almost every possible API that you need to modify the default configuration to suit your custom layout and needs. So the grid specification that we talked about earlier, to implement it, you'd have something like this. This is just for the breakpoints. There's like a load of other shit there. But if you want it, what was done in option 1 and 2, set it up like that. And then, hey, isn't that so good? Oh man, like, you would have to apply the classes to your component accordingly, but you can do it. It is possible. And maybe like if they are very regularly used combinations of classes, you could abstract them into something else, but like this is the most raw and basic version in Tailwind, and yes, you can do it. So, okay, here, this is the fun part. Like this is not a hypothetical situation. It actually does work. Like it was not pseudocode, my friends. So if you click the link, it goes to the sandbox, and if you open it up, like this is all 3 of the different implementations. And let's just build this like totally fictitious, ridiculous website. The image is not loading. I'm very sad. But there was an image here. So again, oh sheesh. In fact, okay. I need better glasses is what I need. So if you turn on the grid inspector, I can't even see my cursor. This is so sad. Why is it not changing? You know what? I'm just gonna scroll, and I'm like, please assume that if I changed my, oh wait, I can just change the entire viewport by doing this. No, I cannot. Whoa. Okay. Yeah, okay, there we go. So you can, I really wanted to turn on the highlighter so you could see like how the 4 columns became 8 columns, became 12 columns. But like, well, that's life, huh? So like this link is public, so if you're interested, you can check it out later. But the fact that it does work, it's possible. The code that we talked about, it wasn't very long, right? If you think about it, it wasn't that much code. Even the Tailwind one wasn't that much code, but it still works. And so we just covered 3 options, right? But there's so many more possible approaches to take when you want to implement these grid specifications. Are any one of those options the correct one or the best one? I cannot answer that, not without taking into account the context in which the code needs to be used. Because technically, as you've seen, every approach can do the job. The level of difficulty of the technical implementation sometimes pale in comparison to the issues and considerations around code organization, code maintainability, and the developer experience of the people, of the devs on your team, especially if your team is really big. For example, maybe a particular application uses like a component-based architecture. So responsibility for specific features can be encapsulated in respective components. Depending on the size of the application, some components could even be maintained by separate teams, right? Or in another organization, it could be like a couple of front-end specialists maintaining a component system that's used by everyone else, right? The permutations are endless. Like just the number of people sitting here working for different organizations, your teams and your code organize very differently. And then there's also a chance that someone from above you in the hierarchy mandates that you use a certain technology. Have I heard an executive who used to code come and tell me and say like, well, hey, I could have built this in a day by myself if I used insert favorite library here? Well, yes, I have encountered such executives. So sometimes there are things that are outside of your control, and that is okay. But in those instances where you do have the opportunity to influence technical decisions, I find that asking the following questions can help you make a more informed choice. For example, what are the preferred technology stacks used in your organization? Because usually there is one. For example, it's public knowledge that Shopify is a Ruby on Rails shop. And it's not like we refuse to do anything else. And there are projects that use other tech stacks, but we do need a good reason to deviate from the standard stack. So from a CSS perspective, this would impact where your code lives. Can you use a preprocessor or not? How your selectors might look, depending on how much control over the markup that you have, and so on. The size and structure of your application will also have a significant impact on the points I mentioned, on how your final CSS will look like, where it will live. How flexible is your design system? How flexible does it need to be? Because the more flexible it has to be, the more complicated your code might become because you have to cater for more use cases. This is where having a really close relationship with the design team helps. Like what Laura said, it shouldn't be like a handoff and I never see this ever again, right? Because a design system might start out as the output from a design team, but its success hinges on the code actually reflecting what was being intended. Are there cases where your code is constantly having new developers come in and contribute? What's the documentation culture like? Because these 2 points are related. If there are new folks constantly being onboarded to contribute to your project regularly, there does need to be solid documentation to explain what the expectations are and how things work. Otherwise, your code descends into chaos fairly quickly. Trust me, I have been there. And then maintenance. It is not the most exciting thing in the world. I have never seen executives falling on each other to advocate for a maintenance project. Like, oh, we need this maintenance project now. No, never saw it. But hey, systems work because someone is maintaining them and keeping them humming along. So who are these people for your project? Is it a centralized setup? Is it spread across different teams? What's the skill level of the folks on these teams? Because this will also impact and influence your choice of approach here. Now, I have an unorthodox suggestion for decision-making in these cases, and that is to not look at the pros of all the approaches that you're considering, because all of them have pros. That doesn't help. Look at all the cons. Analyze the cons and see which ones you and your team can live with. Because there's no perfect world. There will be cons, and you have to accept those and see which ones are the ones like, okay, we can tolerate that, and we can live with that. And after all that time and effort to think about like selecting the approach and everything, there's one more critical thing to do before actually diving into the fun stuff of writing the code. Writing code is fun. What I said is less so, but you have to do it. Because I'm not sure if any of you have the same experience as me when you onboard onto a new code base, but I always have lots of questions about why certain things are done in a certain way, especially if it's a pattern that I've never ever seen before. And early on in my career, I had a phase where I thought I knew better, and I'd be kind of judgmental about the code I came across, and I'm like, ew. But now, now I tend to go around like digging through the code base in the hopes of finding some documentation about why a particular choice was made. Because sometimes you might find that, yes, it was really a bad idea at the time. Someone had to put something up because of a deadline or an executive breathing down their backs. But then you might also discover that it was because of some constraints or some dependencies that were not obvious to you at first glance as someone new to the code base. So the why documentation is different from how documentation, because you always hear people like, oh, we didn't write the documentation because, our application updates so fast. The documentation got obsolete in like 6 hours because we're so fast. Sure, that's for the how documentation. But like why documentation is a little bit different because it kind of explains why things are. And that kind of documentation is more the vibe of like cheddar cheese or whiskey. They only get better with age, right? So is it possible to use CSS Grid in a large commercial application from a technical perspective? Absolutely yes. Is there a best way to implement it? Well, there will be a best way for your team to do it. There will be a best way for like someone else's team to do it, which will be completely different from the best way for my team to do it because of all these factors that I just talked about. So if you ever get the chance to implement CSS Grid in your project, I would love to hear you talk about it or write about it if you can. Because even though your approach is very specific to your situation and your context, it might still inspire someone else who's working on theirs. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. That was great. Oh, thanks. How is your vision right now? Maybe it was just the nerves.
I can see thank you. Thank you is great. I can't see anything else, so I probably need a visit to the optician.
All right. Okay, so as before, if you have any questions, please put them into video. And I apologize to, I think, Roland, because I didn't see your message before, because I only was checking the chat of the room, but I now have full access to everything, so just put it somewhere on the internet and I'll see it. All right, so first question from Sasha. Hui Jing, are there times where you prefer CSS Flex over CSS Grid? Do you have like a general guideline you're following yourself?
Yeah, so for myself, usually I will call on grid when I do need structure, like I mentioned, between the grid, the columns and rows. So like if I want something very specific in like say a little bit to the right and then the other one like right at the bottom corner. So it's kind of like a full 2D XY coordinate thing. I will definitely reach for grid. But a lot of times, like when I build, somehow in applications, everyone has to build a nav bar. Nav bars are like such a thing. But like if I need to build a nav bar, usually I'll go with Flexbox because unless your nav bar is like a grid, usually it's like just one straight line, right? But the challenge for nav bars is like how to get everything to kind of line up nicely across all the different viewports. And for that, Flexbox is great because Flexbox gives us access to the box alignment properties. And also, Flexbox does auto margins very well. So for example, I'm just going to describe it. Let's say you have a logo in the header, and then you have like a bunch of like login or sign up things on the right side. You can literally just like margin left auto, bump it all the way to the right and call it a day. You don't really have to add other things, so it kind of keeps the code really dry. So for situations like that, I'll use Flex. You can use Grid for that, but I feel it's a little overkill. So that's just my personal thing, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. So that's the thing. That's the thing I realize about CSS, that some people are uncomfortable. Like, but what is the best way? I'm like, there's no best way, but there has to be one. Like, there isn't one. I'm like, I'm going to walk away now. So, you know, it is what it is.
All right, thanks. All right, next question from Thomas. Hi, Thomas. Any remaining browser inconsistencies you often have to work around?
Oh, I got one. I got one fun one that was really, really recent. It has to do with background clip. So this is nothing grid related, but I thought it was fun. So background clip is this property that allows you to do, if you do background clip text, so if you have some like fancy image or gradient and you want that on like your beautiful headline text, you can use background clip text. So if you put a gradient or an image on the background, it will clip to the text. And then you got like really fancy text. And I thought browser support was great. Like, oh, it looks great in Firefox. Oh, it looks great in Chrome. Even looks great in Safari, the latest version. And then suddenly I get a ping from like the designer like, hey, it's not working on my iPad. I'm like, what do you mean it's not working on your iPad? It's working on my iPad. And then she's like, oh, well. I'm like, what version is it? Like 15.2. So for context, it's 15.6. Like Apple has told you to update your system. So apparently the fix, because what Safari did before 15.4, just like the rendering was wrong. So the entire gradient just didn't show up. So my text was not there. And they're like, I don't read where's your text? I'm like, it's there. It's like, no, it's not there. That's because Safari had a bug. It was a browser bug that was only fixed in 15.4. So I had to jump through a number of hoops and hack the feature query to have a feature query to detect the contain property, because the contain property was released in 15.4. And then put the hack there. So it's kind of like the old style where you do the MS, like the Microsoft, like IE11 fixes. I'm like, I feel like I went back 10 years, but it is what it is. So rare, it's a lot rarer today to have inconsistencies. Like the fact that Safari shipped it in 15.5 means people are fixing the bugs. It just doesn't come out at the right time. So sometimes, you know, you're just like, I'm on 15.2, yo. I'm like, okay, we'll fix it for you. But honestly, much less so, like in recent years than before. Yeah.
Does this work on Internet Explorer? Did you check that?
It does. No, fun. So the solution, no, it works because you don't have to show the gradient on Opera Mini or 11. So it's just like black text.
Oh.
Yeah.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Things don't have to look the same on every browser, yo. Yeah.
No, yeah, exactly. As long as you see it. All right. So next question coming from Laura. Do you have any tips for writing maintainable and readable grid and Flexbox CSS, especially in shorthand and with media queries? It can get pretty abstract.
100%. So that was the reason why I actually explicitly talked about the grid area code, because what I realized is that using the named grid areas allowed me to keep the code a little more compact and isolated on the container. As for the shorthand, I kind of fall in line with what is recommended in the spec. So if you happen to come across the official CSS specification in Flexbox, they do say that for Flex, try to use the Flex shorthand, because what the Flex shorthand does is that it correctly resets the other components. So Flex is made out of 3 components: Flex Grow, Flex Shrink, and Flex Basis. When you use the Flex shorthand instead of the explicit components themselves, the other components kind of reset to sensible defaults. So it's interesting the shorthand thing came up, because there's some instances where using the shorthand kind of screws up because it resets. On the flip side, the Flex shorthand gives you sensible defaults, so it's kind of like unscrews up. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like context matters. It's not like a blanket rule that you should never use shorthand. You should always use shorthand. But I think that helps. Rather than saying like Flex Grow, Flex Shrink, Flex Basis, and having a whole block of Flex properties, the Flex shorthand itself is good enough, honestly. Yeah.
I'm nodding, but I have no idea what you just said.
It's okay.
Right.
Okay.
It answered Laura's question. That's the most important.
My mom doesn't know what I do for a living. Oh, she does computers.
Yeah.
That's what she tells the neighbors.
Same. All right. Oh, there's so many questions. We still have time. All right. So, do you have examples of public design systems using CSS Grid in a nice way?
That's a trick question. Let me get back to you on that. I'll post it on Twitter when I find it.
All right. That's Miro. They will.
Oh wait, actually, I saw a really smart. I saw a talk the other day by Martin, who works for Figma.
Oh.
So Figma is a web application, and they use CSS Grid in a really interesting way. But because Figma, as an application, has very unique interface that it's just for Figma. So that use case is probably very specific to Figma. But if you inspect the Figma code, you'll find that their icons, their buttons, and the way they do the sidebar on the right, they do use a lot of CSS Grid. So yeah, try Figma. I think Figma does it in a very interesting way.
All right, cool. I think this is the final question. Does Grid support LTR? I don't know what that means. Is it LTR or ITR?
Right to left, left to right. Grid itself is a direction agnostic thing, so to speak, because the direction of your content is determined by the direction and the language, right? So in a sense, I don't know if you're asking about the Grid Inspector, but I know the Firefox Grid Inspector, if your content is right to left, the grid numbers correspond correctly. I think it's a little bit buggy for the Chrome and Safari, just because the overlay feature itself is relatively new. Because I used to do a lot of vertical writing, and when I use Grid for the overlay, it's correct. So when I do vertical writing in Chinese, the grid lines and items, they flip accordingly. And the properties you use for Flexbox and Grid, they are not less physical directions. So it's more of when you do Flex, for example, Flex direction, you use row and column. So if you flip it, then you kind of have a mentally kind of flip the thing and use the correct property. I have no shortcut for this other than I just know this because I experienced it. But if you're talking about whether these layout models support right to left, I would say yes. So because I'm not very sure what the scope of the question is. So yes, it does. It works in different directions. Let's put it that way.
Short answer, yes. All right. There's a new final question.
Okay.
How well does position sticky work inside Grid?
Interesting. I haven't encountered any weirdness when I used it the last time. So I would say, is it not working for you? Talk to me.
I think it's they're asking how well, so they probably expect a number, 2.
37.5. Right there.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.